Right, so welcome to my final evaluation on my media project. So yeah, in this evaluation, I'll identify what skills I have developed, what new skills I've learned, why it's important that I've learned these skills, what I would like to improve on, and what I will do differently next time. And yes, this is that is my goal for today. So let's get started, shall we? Right. So first of all, context. My context was originally I was inspired to make this film by a multitude of different sources from from media in from written media with books such as A Higher Call by Adam Makos, and also other books such as Catch 22, as well, as I find them to be compelling and also very how would you put it? Very they're very compelling and a nice read, as I find they work well with the genre itself, and they almost, like, you can easily lend them to a screenplay themselves. If you were to put enough time into it, they could be amplified into screenplays. I was also very heavily inspired by war films. These being films a um, such as Saving Private Ryan, and the sort of more modernist war films in general. So Saving Private Ryan, 1917, and that sort of era of filmmaking, moreover than the older era. I was also very much inspired by our very recent trip to Berlin in earlier in the year, which was a a very nice insight into how war and such has affected culture, and how it's affected the world over the years, because Berlin and Germany itself has been the center of many different wars, uh, the the flashpoint for the entire of the Cold War, which means that it has always been very synonymous with war and the military. And I also am really interested in war movies themselves, as I find that I'm very interested in the history behind them. So I really do enjoy going into a history film and picking out what's accurate in the film and what isn't. And by doing this, I personally enjoy that, as I can almost, like, it helps me get a better understanding of the film itself, so I can, like, go in and see what the limitations of modern technology is, compared to say what technology they had back then. For example, like, certain films, they may have, like, choose to have characters in different locations than they ever were, and this can bring something to the film, but it can also subtract to it from other ways. And I enjoy looking into this, as I find that people will almost change history to make it more entertaining, and it's it's quite interesting. And I also got the inspiration for this as, like, war like war the genre of war lends itself to many different sort of palettes, as, for example, writing and comics, podcasts and stuff. But I decided and chose to do a film, as I feel that I am more comfortable using a camera than, say, like, talking on a podcast, or working working with a pen and writing. And it's good. it was enjoyable. We did have a couple restrictions, of course, with working with the genre, as I mean, COVID-19 and the current outbreak of coronavirus has put a strain on, not well, yes, put a strain on the abilities for resources and areas to film, as it as due to the current lockdown that the United Kingdom is in, we are unable to really go outside, and we don't have the ability to use many of the wonderful areas that could be used for filming in such a manner, sadly. But that is really um, with the current climate. But I feel as though with the film I've created, the genre still works well, and I've hit the codes and conventions. For example, like the washed out color palette of many modern war films with for example, Saving Private Ryan, all the colours are very dulled down and stuff like that. While if you look at older war films like, say, the Battle of Britain, the colours are quite bright, but then that also lends it to itself as it is an aerial film. So, but that's something completely different and unrelated. I feel like I also fit the setting quite well, as the the setting, while it was, or the setting is the location of a real world battle during World War II, where the Russians, during the liberation or the liberation, depending on your side of history, of Hungary, they and sort of on the or during the German retreat through Central Europe, they the Germans performed a counterattack, thus spreading the Soviets, or causing some sort of dissent in the Soviet ranks, and it caused for a lot of like spread among men, meaning that groups of men and singular men would separate from their units, and this lent itself quite well to the film that I was creating, as I felt that it worked, especially with the sort of limited scope of characters and equipment that I had on hand. So I feel like that was good. I feel like mise en scène, while it was decent, it could have been better, as the film was filmed in my garden, and due to how my garden is, being on a semi suburban sort of setting on the edge of a village, I my garden has sheds and log cabins in it, and I feel as though I could have helped it in some way by not having them there, and also there is the inclusion of after looking back at the footage, a red sledge, which made of plastic, which is not perfect really, but it could be. But looking past that, everything that's really there could be seen as being around the time period, as we did our best to cover up as much of the offending items of a what would you call it, sort of like historical inaccuracy as possible. But yes, with I also worked very hard to get the costumes correct. So for example, the Russian has a helmet. The helmet that he's wearing is Polish Army surplus, which uses the exact same specifications as the Russians would during the time. The and all of his clothing was military gear and ex-military gear. The same goes for the German. His hat is of a 1950s vintage of a Austrian soldier, though the same sort of model of hat has been used by the Germans was used by the Germans from early in World War One to late sort of 1950s, when they moved over to the style of camouflage that my character was wearing, as his jacket, which is a sort of, the camouflage is very similar to the German camouflage of the German army during the late 40s. It's known as Flecktarn, and that camouflage is still used up until this day in a different sort of style, where it's been worked on, and they've used it to sort of add more on. But you can tell that this one, or this type of uniform that I was wearing, is from a much later date, as it has the insignia of the West German army on it. In fact, I believe, yes, the 1980s is when this type of shirt was being worn, which is a shame. But due to the nature of the shirt itself, the German army, or the flag of Germany, does sort of stand out. Which I would, if I could have, I would have removed it. But sadly, removing it would have damaged the fabric and made the jacket unusable. It would have, which is a shame. I also feel as though my understanding of the genre has improved greatly through the understanding of the techniques and the cinematography, as I feel the cinematography has improved. I've been able to improve my understanding of the genre through the understanding of techniques and the cinematography. For example, now cinematography is the genre itself, like war films. They lend themselves to cinematography such as like follow shots, and as this helps you bring yourself, and very much sort of first person, like eye level shots, because it helps you bring you right into the action itself, and makes the scenes more tense, as you feel as though you are in the scenes. As this was brilliantly exemplified in, or it first started to sort of pop up in war films such as Saving Private Ryan, like especially in the Omaha scene, where majority of the shots are shot from points of view that someone on the beach could quite naturally see. So, for example, there's the scene of that's taken from over the shoulder of a German machine gunner, and this brings you right into the scene of seeing what the Germans saw is like these hundreds and hundreds of Americans rushed up onto the beach off these tiny little metal landing craft. And you also see it from the Americans' point of view as well, all from eye level shots. Is like, and the same with the underwater sequences. It's like, underwater sequences. Yes, it's all shot from a sort of level where you could theoretically put a person, and it helps draw the viewer right into the scene itself. And this ultimately adds so much to the scene, as it really just helps add something to the scene itself. I also I feel as though the genre has improved my sort of set design, as I'm naturally passionate about the genre anyway. I am, so set design was a bit easier for me, as I sort of knew what to look for, though due to the limitations that I had, I wasn't able to get the set that I desired, as my original desire for a set was for it to all be, or was for this little video to be set entirely within a basement or a shell hole. But sadly, I didn't have access to either of them at the time of filming, so I had to make do, and we had to change the script quite radically, which was a shame. Editing. So with editing, I feel as though the scene, or not the scene, but the genre really it desires, especially in the it really desires the sort of a darker color palette, and everything needs to be sort of a bit washed out with greys. As in war, you never there's no brightness in war. Nothing should stand out as and be sort of seen as bright and cheery, because war is a very dark, depressing matter, and it's very sort of how would you put it? Very yeah, it's a very depressing subject matter, and to make light of it can be seen as a bit distasteful if it is not done correctly. Thus, sort of war films are very dark and moody, with a few exceptions, of course. Exceptions of this are films such as like Kelly's Heroes, which is quite bright when it comes down to it, though it with how its characters and the film itself is portrayed. But that is a kind of an outlier when it comes to it. But yeah, it depends on the film, because with films such as Black Hawk Down, there are a lot, and Black Hawk Down, Saving Private Ryan, the colours are very washed out. There's not really any bright colours. But then you can also get war films that have a lot brighter colouring as well. And but then also sometimes what they do is they'll brighten certain colours while tone down others. So certain films will tone down most colours, but then red, like the blood and red, is always brighter, as to draw your eye to it. And that can work sometimes, but also sometimes it doesn't. I also feel that audio editing is very important for and my understand or very important for the genre, and my understanding of it has risen immensely as due to the due to when I or due to my filming when I was filming the I'm not even sure what you'd call it now. When I was filming the piece, we were unlucky that our neighbours were next door and they were being rather noisy. So it left me to have to completely rework the scene itself, and luckily managed to do it. Managed to redo all the audio using I used a like, royalty-free, beg my pardon, royalty-free sounds, and for some of the background noise to provide like the sound of artillery bombardment and stuff, and I feel that audio is 90% of the story when it comes to a war film, because war films don't always need talking. You don't need exposition dumps in war films. I feel like you can tell as much story in a war film with just sound, and then you can with either radio chatter or just two characters speaking. I feel like there is better you can do with sound, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There was also the issues of representation where I forgot. There we are, working again. Sorry about that. I personally feel I dealt with the theoretical issues of representation and theoretical issues of representation. What am I on about? I feel as though I handled the issues of representation well, as due to the setting, the of the war, or of where this piece was taking place, which was Hungary in 1945. The two sides are very heavily dominated by sort of by white males, so we didn't really have to worry about issues of representation in that way. And I also feel like we did representation well, as we made sure to provoke neither side as a villain, and to and with that, I feel like that really helped sort of the sequence, as you didn't really, as it didn't make you feel sort of anger at either one. You just, it was very sort of oh, blimey. Um, where we made sure not to villainify the either side, as at this point in the war, um, all sides had distaste for the war, and people just wanted it to end, and that's I sort of we did our best to make sure that neither side was seen as bad, as at the end of the day, it's the humanity of man, and or war will push humans to their absolute worst and their absolute best, and there's yeah, we've just made sure not to villainify either side. Um, with the act structure, oh, blimey, what am I on about? In my piece, I feel like I used narrative codes such as the use of Enigma with the book, as that sort of gave the audience something to think about, as why did this Russian soldier want this book, and why did he pocket it? What was there of interest within it? And I feel as though this book sort of draws the audience in, as it makes you want to know more about it, and like what's so special about this book? Why is it important, and why did the soldier want it? Why did he pocket it? And this is I feel like this is a use of Enigma, and it helps you sort of pull yourself in towards being invested in the video itself, as you sort of learn, or not learn more about the characters, but you sort of want to know more about the characters, and more about the book, and what is happening with this book itself. And that's what's quite, I find, is or what I believe to be quite a good use of Enigma, as it draws the audience in, making you want to know more. And I feel like that's good. Now, yes. Now on to, of course, research. So, if you give me, let me just. So when it comes down to research, I decided what I needed to research as sort of first things first. I was like, all right, I need to research the context of where my setting, of where I'm going to set this, and I boiled it down to sort of two main options. I boiled it down to June 1944 in northern France, or late 1945 or 1945 in the sort of in the final days of the war. Not final days, but sort of the final months of the war, with the German counterattack in Hungary, in a attempt to retake the city of Bulgarest, I believe it's pronounced. I am not, or Budapest. Budapest, that's it, I believe. And yes, I felt that setting it there would be a good way to have the characters separate from their respective sort of squads and troops, and this would allow me to add the or have the characters meet in the way that they worked. And I believe that my research was thorough enough, as I did research into not only uniforms but settings, and the settings themselves, the dates. I got generalized maps of the area, and sort of what would add on to this this area and how it would allow sort of the characters to meet, and in what sort of form, what could be used to keep them sort of get them to communicate or get them to interact with each other. And it was through this that I felt that these two locations and settings stood out the most to me. And yeah, how did the primary and secondary research influence your production? So, primary research. So, going to Berlin was a huge inspiration for our sort of completely fell out my head there. Very sorry about that. Yes, going to Berlin was a huge sort of like huge sort of pull of primary research for me, as it let me sort of pull my head into the genre, and it allowed me to yeah, it allowed me to sort of get my sort of ideas, as Germany is, as I said before, steeped in sort of the history of war, being with Germany being a very famous warmongering nation, and it being the start and end of World War II with the German invasion of Poland, and with the orders being taken from or the orders of the men on the ground being given by the men in Berlin, and then the war itself ending in the Reichstag in Berlin, and it's that building is so sort of synonymous with the end of the war now, and it's also synonymous with the start of the Cold War and communism in Germany and Europe, or its lasting presence there, as there's the extremely famous photo of Russian soldiers flying the flag of the Soviet Union over the bridge, or not the bridge, over the edge of the roof of the Reichstag. And it's photos like this that have sort of brought Berlin into sort of a very sort of spotlight when it comes to sort of history and war itself. And this allows this allows people to sort of helped me. My most apologies. I feel as though this really sort of helped like influence my research and my production, and yes, that is something that really helped me sort of bring my research in and influence the production itself. It did. My research into the topic did allow me to sort of did allow me to create something new by building off information and work of others, as I read several books by several different authors on different subjects of war itself. And one book that stood out to me a lot was a Higher Call, a book by Adam Makos. It follows it is I believe a biography, I believe is what you call it, of a German flying ace during World War II called Franz Stiegler. It is, and it's a very sort of interesting book, as it's a very like unabridged series of events telling of the sort of like of this man's journey from becoming a civilian pilot at the start of the war, and flying three-engined transport aircraft from Berlin to all over the world, and as a sort of as a job to becoming a fighter pilot and becoming an ace, and then through that he like sort of kept painting and painting, or painting? No, he kept flying and flying, and eventually, like he during the, I believe it's the summer or the winter of 1943, December the 20th, 1943, he spares a B-17 bomber who has been extremely badly shot up. It was flying on, I believe, two engines. It was, and as two engines, as one was completely knocked out and the other one had been reduced to zero power, as if they had powered it up, it would have caught fire and exploded, killing everyone on board. As he flew alongside, he realised that every single person in that aircraft was wounded. He did, and he then proceeded to escort it from Germany all the way back to Britain. And he knew that if anyone ever found out that he'd done this, he would be executed. But he still carried on, and he still did it. He did, and as he felt that it was the right thing to do, and he felt that if he shot a man, he would be a murderer, as one of his oldest friends and his old commanding officer told him that that if he shot a man under a parachute, he was no good. He was no better than, I believe he said, a Nazi thug. It was something about the Holocaust at the time, as neither of them were very politically charged, but they believed that shooting a man under a parachute was the equivalent to murder, and Franz felt that if he did the same to them, he would have been no different to a murderer. So he then proceeded to escort them back to England as a way to make sure that they didn't die, as an effort to keep them alive. And it's an amazing story. Franz ended up becoming one of the first fighter pilots in the world to fly jet aircraft with the Messerschmitt 262, and Charlie Brown, the pilot of the B-17, also survived the war and ended up meeting each other after the war itself, and they became extremely good friends. They did, and it was through that sort of drawing, or no, not that sort of drawing, that incident back in December 1942, or 43 in fact. Get your dates right, Jack. It was through that they became good friends, and they ended up after the war becoming good friends up until their deaths. And I believe they passed away in, correctly, I believe it was 1990, in the 1990s. I believe it was, 1995 was the year, I believe. But yes, it was very. So it was a very moving story, and it touched me. It was quite personal to me, especially with aircraft and aviation being such a big part of my life. And of course, the other sort of research that I did that helped me sort of build on the information was the World at War documentary, which it's an older documentary, but it uses a lot of old footage, and it's very sort of in depth with how it works. And I felt as though this really helped me sort of get a grasp on what it was like during the war, and this helped. And I also used some fictional sort of depictions of it with Band of Brothers. While the characters are fact, some of the actions that do happen are fictional, and it's a very interesting sort of thing to read, watch, and that was quite an inspiration for my show, yes, for my piece it was. Now, on to practical skills. Now, practical skills. This is where the fun begins. So, when I was doing my practical skills, the skills I feel as though I developed were I feel as though I developed my audio editing, and I developed that greatly. I did, as due to sound issues when recording, it meant that I had to go back and build a soundscape from scratch. Every footstep had to be put in, and every sort of rattle of a gun, the sliding of an action, the cocking of a rifle, the rustling of trees, the distant sounds of artillery, all had to be mixed together. And luckily, there are sort of sources with royalty-free sites where you can find certain sounds, such as the sound of distant artillery, which was very useful to sort of bring the soundscape together, and sort of bring everything together to remind you that while visually it may not seem like a war zone, it's supposed to be one, and with the artillery in the background, it reminds you that this is a war zone, and that there is death and destruction going on, that you may not be able to see it, but you can still hear it. Cinematography. So, cinematography, I feel that follow shots lend themselves. I had a go at doing a follow shot, as I feel it lends itself to a war movie, especially sort of modernist war films, which sort of have appeared in recent times, with sort of most famously being like Saving Private Ryan, with sort of like and 1917, with all the follow shots down through trenches and everything, as it makes you feel like you are a soldier in the war. And while compare this to older war films such as A Bridge Too Far or Kelly's Heroes, which are shot from almost like a third person perspective, it drags you out of the character and makes you feel like you're a fly on the wall. It does, unlike Saving Private Ryan or 1917, where you feel like you could be there, you could be a soldier in that time period, like with them, and it's quite interesting, especially with how it's shot. So while A Bridge Too Far, it's also because A Bridge Too Far uses real characters and real people, it sort of has to be shot as a fly on the wall sort of style of film, in in more of a third person's perspective, as you really can't sort of, you can't really change history, and A Bridge Too Far was changed from being it's one of the most realistic films out there. It is, but some of it was changed from the truth to fiction, because it was felt that people wouldn't believe that certain things happened. For example, there's quite a famous scene where I believe it's a captain runs across the street while he's being attacked by machine gun fire, but in real life he walked across it with an umbrella. He did, as he didn't want to show his men. He wanted to show his men a taste of bravery, that he wasn't scared of the Germans, and it's quite famously well documented. But he was he felt that it wasn't but they felt it wasn't realistic and people wouldn't believe it if he walked across, so they changed it. They did. So it sort of, but from how it's shot, you you don't feel as connected to the scene itself as you're viewing it from a little ways down the streets, but all the British soldiers' guns are pointing towards you, and and but the Germans are firing over your head, so you don't really feel as though you are in the scene. You feel like you're watching it, and it sort of detracts from the movie, but it also adds to it in other ways. As certain characters sort of they work better viewed from sort of like the third person. They do, and it's almost like it's very different between modernist and sort of classic war films. For example, films like Kelly's Heroes, they're very sort of Kelly's Heroes and The Bridge Too Far are very sort of like, yes, up the Allies, and like the Allies won the war, things like that, and it's very sort of like triumphant, especially with other films like The Longest Day, and that's due to the historical context of the time with like war or with the Cold War being on. They wanted to sort of boost the popularity of the Americans and the British as much as they could, and this sort of got the nation sort of was to get the nation sort of like, yes, we're the best in that sort of way, and it worked to a point, and it was films like that which were almost seen as glorifying. While they didn't mean to, they sometimes were seen as sort of glorifying war and glorifying the death, but that wasn't really their intent. However, like you've got, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got stuff like films like Saving Private Ryan, which are almost like this new era of war film with the modernist movement, where it's everything's more gritty, and they make it so there's no true sort of villain. For example, there's quite a famous scene where two American soldiers just after the Omaha Beach scene, they shoot dead two surrendering Germans. Now these Germans aren't actually Germans; they're Czech soldiers, and they're saying, "Please don't shoot me! Please don't shoot me! I'm Czech." But this soldier, he speaks German but not Czech, and he shoots them both. And it shows this and as a way of saying that nobody's innocent in war. Everybody does something, like does terrible things, and this is also compounded by the scene later in the film where the main group of characters beat a German prisoner after he shot their friend, and it's scenes such as that sort of add more to the feeling of the film itself, as it says that like there is no true good in war. Nobody wins, and it works. It's an interesting take, and I feel it's a better sort of take on films of that sort of era, because while films like A Bridge Too Far and Kelly's Heroes, Battle of Britain, they're all fun films to watch, they almost don't have the sort of like take on the war, and the villains can be almost sometimes comical. For example, like in Kelly's Heroes, the one of the main villains, he's very sort of comically seen as German. He's got like the scar and the he's quite a and he's got quite square jaw. He's very stereotypical blonde hair, blue eyes, and it while modernist movement with like Saving Private Ryan, all sorts, and they've got the Czechs and nobody's good. Um, I also feel as though like costumes and props, those practical skills were I sort of tried to go all in with them with the camouflage patterns being of use in during that time period. That hats were the hats that we were using were of that time period, and everyone. And the only sort of like there are certain bits that could have been changed for sure, but we with what we had available, I tried to make as realistic looking um, outfits as possible, and with and same with the props. For example, we used a wooden stick grenade, and the Russian soldier was carrying a pistol that would have been used during that time period. However, the German, his rifle is a rifle that first started appearing. I believe it was the sort of 1980s, 1990s. It's built off of the M4 cart or the M4 chassis, which is a very common chassis nowadays, and first started appearing sort of just before the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Thus, it sort of dates the rifle to a much later time period. However, I sort of by using a canvas wrap, it gave me the sort of ability to hide a lot of the more modern features of the weapon while still making it usable for the scene. And it was through this that I could almost like add everything together, and it gave it that feel that this could be a weapon that was used during the Second World War, and I'm quite pleased with that. I am. Editing. Now the editing for this I found was quite simple. Yeah, it really what was most needed of it was to build tension. It was, and I feel like it did that well. Especially with sort of towards the end with the quicker cuts. I did the sort of like this. We also used match on action very sort of very liberally, as to make sure that the scene flowed smoothly and correctly. This allowed us to sort of get a much better feeling for the for the piece itself, and sort of almost hid the cuts where we needed it to. It allows the characters to sort of feel more fluid and allows them to move around more in the space that they are given, and it allows us to sort of smooth out their movements as they feel a lot more natural instead of sort of jumping around the screen. We had to problem solve quite a lot, really, because due to the current pandemic, we are all locked inside, and we had the problem of a lot of our a lot of the stuff we have is a lot more modern. For example, the rifle is a very modern airsoft rifle, designed for more of a modern use, but with some sort of more clever tricks, we can edit it to look a lot older, and we can scuff it up and damage it to make it look like it's been used, and is a lot more sort of historically friendly to the setting of World War Two. Teamwork. Now, teamwork was a bit strenuous in our group at times. There's sort of certain certain things almost got laid on other people, and out of those, almost like out of the blue. So, and it felt as though some things had to like. It felt like sometimes you almost had to redo stuff yourself, otherwise it would. I felt personally that some things were sort of like weren't done to the standard that they could have been done to. So yeah, but I feel as though this sort of how would I put it? This sort of put a strain on the group, and I feel as though our final pieces will vary quite differently because of how we've done it, and because our sort of teamwork fell apart. Organisation, I feel like could have also been better as well. So that's sort of another issue that we had. I also feel like my organisation could have been a bit better, as the sort of final parts of this project, I always seem to let the um I sort of end up like letting the deadline creep up on me, as you could say, which is a bit of a shame. Yes. But yeah. How will these help with future products? Change set and costume recycling. I can definitely recycle some of the costume stuff, and definitely some of the set stuff as well. With for example, the bag we used, the belts, those can be recycled. The boots can be recycled. The hat, maybe use it as set dressing for a background, just something different, or sci-fi. Those hats naturally lend themselves to sci-fi as they've got built-in headsets. So that sort of means that you can remove some flaps and remove some bits of fabric, and you've got yourself almost like a sci-fi, almost like helmet for a pilot or something. And add some goggles on, maybe an oxygen mask. You're perfect. You're done. You've got like a sci-fi sort of helmet for a vehicle driver. I can definitely reuse parts of the set. For example, that book could be more than easily reused. Maybe not the stick grenade or the weaponry, but I can reuse the bag, and the weaponry could be reused. If you did something that was like very sci-fi or steampunk, they could be placed into that. So yeah, I also feel that the skills will help me develop, will help me with future projects, as sort of like I'm now more confident with more confident with audio editing and cinematography, and yeah, do your practical skills help create a product suitable for its genre? I think yes. I feel like we stuck true to the history as close as we could. The costumes were, I would say, pretty accurate with the sort of like you get the feeling that it is a war, it's World War Two. The audio with our sound effects, I made sure to include sort of like very sort of the constant background of like artillery fire and war and machine gun fire in the background, as I felt that by doing this it helped sort of distract, or not distract, but remind the viewer that there is a war going on. This isn't just two people, this is hundreds, thousands, that you just can't see them. And I feel that this does help. I didn't use music, as I felt like it would pull. I used it was music used in the title sequence, which was a song sung by American paratroopers during the Second World War. It's about British paratroopers, and it's called "Blood and the Risers," and it's an interesting song. It's a song about how British paratroopers at the time didn't have backup parachutes in case their primary one failed. But and I feel like it fits well with the war theme, as it's as war is always seen like with glory, but it's also very sort of brutal. Um, thing grew confident. And the thing I grew most confident with in my project, or my confidence has grown the most with, is my audio editing. The amount of audio editing I had to do, I feel as though it was very sort of very sort of like tucked down and helped with the project itself, and I feel as though it really sort of dug in and got down to the not nitty gritty, got down to the very sort of having to build a soundscape from scratch with boots and rustling and everything. So I do feel a lot more confident with my audio editing. Yes. I personally feel as though ongoing reflection, I mean, it's helped me, but it hasn't helped me as much as people say it. It's as much as like it's said that it does, as I feel as though that sort of ongoing reflection, it's useful. It is. It'll help. It helps with sort of like, oh, I won't do that again. But then you also get the exact same sort of feeling when you sort of do an overall reflection on your work as a whole. Although ongoing reflection can help pick out sort of other issues that you might have forgotten about if you say, oh, did one final large reflection at the very end of the piece. So instead of doing some ongoing reflection as well, was I able to manage my project well? Well, with this piece, I was sort of I ended up taking a bit more of a management role, and I'd say that I was able to manage my project. I was not be able to manage my project super perfectly. As really my main struggling is the closer I get to a deadline, the sort of like the sloppier my work becomes, and I start rushing things, and I feel as though that's very much down to task management and my priorities. And as I feel as though like as soon as I've got start something, usually 3 or 4 more things pop up around it, and then I'm left to trying to pick up the pieces of those things while also doing my last thing. And I really need to sort of work on the priorities there and get everything in the right order, I would say. The final project. What were the strengths of my final project? Strengths. I would say strengths by far audio. I am extremely proud of the audio. I am. Yeah, extremely happy with it. I feel like the audio is what makes it. It is the amount of time I spent making Foley for the weaponry was a long old time, getting those sounds just perfect to make them sound closer to the real thing than some plastic going clunk clunk and sort of taken away from the scene. So I really went all in on that. What areas of improvement? Areas of improvement, mise en scène. Like, if I could, I would definitely reshoot that in a more suitable location. Sadly, current pandemic and such was a little of a pain, of course, but that's life, and I can't really help that. So I did what I could, and I pushed through it. Did any changes affect the end product? I feel like the end product would have been better if we didn't have the
um, issues of COVID-19 and the issues of the original script sort of being dragged out from sort of underneath us, as it sort of was very much pulled away from the original script due to limitations in location and sort of the number of actors that we had, and that was very much an issue. Audience response to the product, from what I've heard, sadly, the only people I can really show are friends and family, so they might be a little biased, but they have enjoyed it, and they said that they liked, they thought the sound sort of creation was good, and that they said that added to the scene. So I'm pleased with that, and I'm pleased that they thought about that. Though I do hope they were telling the truth. I would say that the final product is suitable for its intended audience, as it's it fits the genre, and and I feel like it's quite easily you could make that into part of something bigger. You could, like, that could be a scene in a bigger, an opening scene in a larger show. It could quite easily, and I feel like that was a good sort of opening for a scene such as that. Um, oh, blimey! Press a button.
When it how do I feel about the audience response to my product? Well, I'm pleased. I am. I'm glad that people liked it and people thought it was good. I do. Like the I do feel the people that said it were biased to my piece. So that does sort of, I feel, take away from it slightly. But I'm pleased that they enjoyed it, and they said it was good, especially my dad, who is a big, like, sort of war film nut. He's very into his war films. He is. So I'm glad that he liked it and he approved of it. So I'm pleased about that. And finally, in terms of media process, the action. In terms of media process and skills, where were you at the start of the unit? So, media processes, sort of the actions and the steps that I have to make. Now, I feel as though I have improved. So, like, the media process, I've certainly improved with my researches. Before, my research has been sort of varying, and I think this might have been because it's a subject that I am genuinely passionate about, especially with film, or war film. I'm very passionate about. Sorry about that. That was an SD card reader falling off of my desk. And I feel as though it's a very sort of, it's something I'm very passionate about, and I'm pleased I could do it. I just and I feel like, because at the start of the unit I was a bit sort of hit or miss with my research. So, and I feel I've learned that, like, there's lots of different ways to research, from practical sort of film, like film and TV, to books, to writing, books and writing, as well as like historical themselves, like documentation and things like that. And skills, sort of practical skills at the start of the unit. Like, some of my practical skills, especially my audio, was I didn't really feel like my audio is very good, but going through this unit, I feel like I have really learnt with audio, and I'm proud of the audio work I've done. I am, and I'm still not perfect, not by a long shot, but I feel like with what I have done, I am pleased with my sort of with how it's
worked together, gone together, and using and sort of with that, I feel like my skills, especially with audio, have improved overall. As my skills with audio used to be sort of, oh yeah, it also used to be very hit and miss. It did. Like, sometimes they'd be very good, other times they'd be pretty naff. And I'd like to think that doing this and being forced to sort of build an audioscape or a soundscape from scratch, that's really helped me. It has, and I've learned a lot when it comes to sort of doing audio in Premiere, and how like layering sounds and stuff. That has been a good help to sort of, and especially also doing Foley. That was difficult because I've learnt that sort of like masking sound, and I ended up having to do a lot of my Foley in a cupboard with a duvet over my head just to mask out sound and to stop echo in especially when doing Foley of quite loud sounds like the cocking of a rifle and the bolt of a pistol. How would I like to develop moving forwards? Well, I'd love to improve on my sound more. I'd love to improve on my definitely improve on my camera work, as I feel as though my cinematography needs to improve, really, because like, as much as I like the sound, I feel as though I could do better when it comes to stuff like follow shots and shots where the camera is moving. Is I feel like sometimes they can be especially with my ones, I seem to suffer from quite shaky hands, so I feel as though it'd be quite nice if I could get it where the camera didn't shake as much. So that might be a case of a gimbal or something, but that's something to look into. It would be, but yes, and I believe, yeah, that concludes my final analysis of final analysis, final yeah um final assessment of my product, or is it analysis? Evaluation. That's the word. Yes, my final evaluation of the product. So yeah, thank you for listening to this. How long now? 1 hour, 7 minutes, and a 35-second slog. So yeah, thank you for listening to that. Bye.